right, first, thank you to Jason and everyone here at Monitorama for having me. I'm Steve. I'm a designer, and I'm here to try to help. My special trait as a designer is that I've been working in monitoring for the last 5 years across 3 companies. I was the first designer at Boundary and Opsmatic, and I enjoyed the experience so much that I decided to start a monitoring company of my own with the group here, most of whom you probably know better than you know me. So, let me talk a little more about why I'm here, because monitoring might not be the most obvious place for a designer to end up spending part of their career. And it's because of this. It's because of engineers like this and groups like this. Design is supposed to be about empathy, and so is monitoring. And I get to work with engineers who care deeply about these problems every day, and who are trying to make the practice of writing software and building infrastructure better. And that's really rewarding and admirable, if nothing else. And it's even more true here, I think, because we're all getting together to talk about open source projects and monitoring, and people are here sharing openly and selflessly products that they're building for the community with little in return. So let me talk a little bit about what I see today in monitoring. And what I see a lot of is dashboards. Dashboards and visualizations. You can build them, you can rearrange them, you can share them. They're pretty much everywhere. And in many ways, that's great. We've gotten so much better at the number of metrics that we can track, the resolutions that we can track those metrics at, parts of the system that are being instrumented that we could never see into before. But sometimes I think Coda created a monster, because that seems to be most of what the conversation is about now. We talk about metrics and resolutions that we can monitor, and it sometimes feels a bit like the early days of computing, talking about megahertz and megabytes and sort of missing the bigger picture of how we're making this experience better for the people that are using these tools. So, and I'm as much a part of this problem as anyone. I mean, it shouldn't even call it a problem, but this is my first dashboard. In fact, you might recognize the network diagram, the Death Star diagram that we showed earlier. It wasn't very successful. I think a big part of that is because, I don't know, has anyone here used the early versions of Boundary, like circa 2012? Okay. This was not a very customizable product. We had the foolish intuition that we could build something that people would just learn how to use our way and would love it for what it was. We've gotten better about that. But in the early days, it was a very flat experience. We had dashboards literally called dashboards 1, 2, and 3. There was no cohesive idea tying these together. There was no rhyme or reason. We just laid them out on the page and figured people would learn and figure it out. And I think that's a big part of the issue with building dashboards like this, is the experience is sort of flat. And part of our job is to actually walk users down this path from observation to action, and I want to talk a little bit later about how we're going to do that better. So, we also spend a lot of time talking about alerting, about threshold detection, and again, this has mostly been awesome. We're getting better at the data that populates these alerts. We're getting better at notifying it at good times. But the experience of receiving the alerts hasn't gotten better to match. It's still often pretty bland, not very helpful, lacking any sort of useful context. So I think this is something we need to do better. And this isn't helped much by the conversation about our work. This happens to be an article about a security company hiring a data visualizer, someone who worked on Ruby to help build their product. And to be clear, this is a talented designer who's done great work, but this is what we collectively latch onto, the vanity of the work. And I think it sort of diminishes the greater role that design can have in making great products. And it kind of pisses me off, because this isn't the user interface. If it doesn't have users, it's not the user interface. And the closest thing that this interface ever had to a user was an actor who was probably standing in front of a green screen. And yet we use this as inspiration, but we should. There are a lot of great products that we can learn from, but most of them are not going to be found in movie theaters. I was also listening to an episode of the New Stack lately, and they were talking about design and monitoring, and a resurgence of design and monitoring, in fact. And the example that they gave was moving from graphite to graphene, and how the change to D3 and Backbone was so much better than our RAD tool. And again, good, we're moving in the right direction. The visual design of these tools, the graphing, the charting, it's improving. But great products have a way of transforming our behavior. Cloud hosting, containerization, microservices, these are all changing the way that we write software, and we should be thinking about our products this way. How can we change the behavior of the people that use them, and how can we make things better? So how can design actually help? How can we be doing things better? So if your company is a brain, design is like the prefrontal cortex. You should be you should be using design to simulate the experience before your team builds it, and most importantly, before your users live it. And I spend a lot of time doing this. The two big benefits that simulating these experiences before you build them have is that first, you can get meaningful feedback from users before you invest the time to build it. And the second, you can actually get the engineering team to buy in on what you're building before the production happens. And some of you in this room have actually seen the early prototypes of Opsy. I spent weeks iterating on them and shopping them around to see what people thought before we started building things. And this has been a really useful exercise because we learn a lot before putting it into paper. The second thing that design can do for you is to help you prioritize. And you can think of building apps a lot like building a transit system, where you decide where the lines go and where the origins and destinations are, and it's your job to prioritize them. So the most important lines are going to be the easiest to access and the fastest to get from source to destination. But those priorities are an expression of your team's choices. And so the choices you make influence people's perceptions of your product. And just as a really quick example of that, this is iOS. So they consciously made this choice to allow you to toggle Wi-Fi on and off from anywhere. I can swipe up and tap and Wi-Fi is on. But if I want to change the network I'm connected to, I've got to go 3 levels deep from the root and choose a different network. And that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just an expression of their priorities as a team. And so every choice that you make about the paths through the products that you're building is affected. So what's specific to our industry is that a lot of the choices that we make, as I say, are leading people down the road from observation to action. And we've already talked about kernel board a couple times today, so I'll try to make this quick. But this is where we can have the greatest impact. And Roy said it this morning, this is our job. It's our job to lead people down this path. And one other qualifier, I kind of added this one box at the top of the research. If you don't know what you're building, you're just getting lucky. So make sure you're actually shopping your ideas around before you go and build them. So, who's doing this well? What can we learn from? Let's start with research. James, who just talked, had an incredible influence on our team a few months ago. He published this series of posts on his blog about monitoring tools, about monitoring practices. And we took this right into investor meetings because there was some great data in here that helped us justify our case for building our product. And Chrissy Bergen's going to talk a lot more about research tomorrow, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But whether you do it yourself, whether you buy it, you steal it, justify the case for what you're building by collecting information. So, let's take another walk down the OODA loop. When you move from observation to orientation, it's all about context. And there are a couple tools that I think are doing this well. Etsy's Nagios Herald was the first tool that I'm aware of to try to embed useful context into alerts in the form of images, of graphs. And I think VictorOps has done a great job of taking this a step further with their trends modifier, where the user can set rules for a certain host that matches a certain name, and then you can decide that you want to attach notes or images or any other sort of links or annotations to that alert. And I think this is a great way of providing meaningful context to help people from just getting a notification that's flat and empty to actually providing rich context. So, from orientation to decision making, I think it's hard to underestimate or hard to overestimate the transformation that ChatOps is having on us. And I think for those of you that have been using IRC for 20 years, this won't seem so transformative, but I think the way that we're using these tools is really changing. Being able to embed rich graphs and useful information into the chat room. And most importantly, I think the products that don't do this well are the ones that try to bring the conversation into their product as opposed to bringing the useful information into where the conversation is already happening. And that is what we should be striving for, to bring our data, wherever it's being generated, into the place where the conversation is already happening. And I would urge you all to think more about how big an effect chat is going to have on the way on-call is done. So lastly, from decision-making to action, CloudWatch does a really good job of this. When you set thresholds, you can tie autoscale actions or instance actions to those thresholds. So if there's a violation, I can scale up or scale down. I can terminate or restart an instance. Those actions, whether they're automated or manual, are built very, very easily into the product, and this is a great way of kind of finalizing troubleshooting. So, time to put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Opsy. We haven't shown anything publicly yet, but I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing to make this experience better. First, you can think of Opsy a little bit like Nagios running inside your cloud environment. we have a CloudFormation template, an AMI that you spin up, and it does the health checking. And what I'm most proud of this is that it enables you to do onboarding from your phone. With a few clicks here, I can choose which regions I'm running in. I can then enter my AWS creds. Opsy will then discover the VPCs that I'm running in inside those regions. I just choose the ones I want to install in, and then the bastions get installed inside the environment. From that point on, they actually have their own creds, so we don't need to store them. And all the health checking is coordinated through our app. So you can think of the app like a remote control for health checks running on the bastions inside the environment. The second thing that we're doing is we're enabling health checks to be created at the group level. So whether you have security groups, tags, regions, and zones, you apply health checks to those entities, and then membership is managed by us. So anytime a new instance comes online and it goes into a security group, we apply all the appropriate health checks. As soon as it comes online, you never have to worry about maintaining them yourself. Lastly, we're trying to make these actions easier. And again, this is something that's enabled by being inside the cloud environment. But we can do things like restart an instance. We can silence alerts. Great. So I'm going to keep playing it. You can do all this right from the UI. And we're trying to make it as easy as possible to take meaningful action right from the app. And it turns out, a lot of times it's just restarting an instance or silencing while some maintenance is going on. And so those are the priorities that we've set, and making those things very tappable right from the product. Last, I would love to hang out longer, but I'm flying home tomorrow because this is my 12-day-old daughter, Stella Jean, and I've got to get back. So I'll be at the bar tonight. I would love to chat more about this, but Stella would love you to try out Opsy, so go to Opsy.com and check us out. I think I've actually got a few minutes extra for questions. Yeah.
What if you're stuck using tools that are worse offenders? Is there a possibility of putting an internal design team to help you make that better for everyone? And what tips would you have for that?
So yes, you can retrofit design onto any product that you're building. The tips that I would have are to get a designer on board, first of all. I was actually having a great conversation about this last night, that I'm not aware of any open source monitoring projects that have design teams attached to them. Does anyone, hands up, does anyone have a designer working on an open source monitoring project that they're doing? Cool, 0. Oh wait, is there anything back there? Oh, 1, all right. So there's one, yeah. And this, I think this is something we should explore. I don't actually have an answer to this. I think getting inside the communities that are building these tools, the small groups, is really the key. I've been interested in getting involved with open source projects. Being 5 months into a startup, that's not something that's totally feasible right now, but find them and get them to love your product. Yeah.
When you're, I know you're not showing any UIs from Opsy, but when you're thinking about monitoring UIs, like what are the things you want to surface immediately to the user?
So my opinion on that has changed a lot over the last few years. I think you can kind of see the evolution from Boundary, the first product I designed, to Opsy, and I think a lot of what I'm trying to do now is a reaction to that it's not fair to say that visualization isn't the answer. There are a lot of kinds of problems that can only be diagnosed by looking at changes in the graph. But one of the bets that we're making now is that as developers, as we move towards more microservice architectures and cloud architectures, developers are owning more of the code that they write and the performance of it. And developers are probably less likely to be staring at a wall of charts than a full-time ops person. So I think it's more important to get actionable information into notifications, for example, than building a really great visualization in a dashboard. So having that information there when it's needed most and not requiring people to actually be looking for it. All right, I think I'm set.